Women of Australia unite and form the Women's Electoral Lobby, an even louder voice for the fair sex. Automation on the assembly line cuts costs, but what's the price in human terms? Boredom and frustration on the production line. We'll be taking a look at the blue-collar blues later in the program. On Tuesday, a group of women protested about an anti-abortion speech in the New South Wales Parliament by marching on Sydney's Parliament House. It was their way of putting a woman's point of view, since there are no women in the New South Wales House of Assembly, just as there are no women in the Federal House of Representatives, although there are 2 female senators. Despite their lack of parliamentary representation, women must have a big say in this year's federal election because more than 50% of Australia's voters are women. Whatever they think and however they vote will be significant. Recent Australian nationwide opinion polls have indicated that women are more likely to vote for the government and less likely to vote for Labor than men, and they're more satisfied with Mr McMahon than with Mr Whitlam. So far, only one non-party organisation, the Women's Electoral Lobby, or WEL, has made any attempt to specifically influence the female vote. They're not putting up any candidates, but they want women voters to know what the candidates stand for. This report on the Women's Electoral Lobby by Terry McMahon.
Sydney Town Hall, March 1972. 6,000 people, the majority women, had come to hear a debate on abortion and birth control, in which the principal speaker was Dr. Germaine Greer. She spoke on the morality of abortion and the conscious decision women had to make in deciding whether to have the operation.
I'm also concerned with the spiritual resonance of our lives, with just how much responsibility we can ever take for our own actions. It seems to me that the history of civilization is the history of people learning more and more about reality and about the ways of dealing with it, and escaping from the ritual stranglehold of virtual unconscious behaviour.
Most of the audience, the largest Sydney had seen on such an issue, came to see and hear Germaine Greer, and she crystallised for many of them the discontent that was already there.
Mr Chairman, I would like to address my remarks to, is it Mr Clark, the first speaker?
Yes.
The man who said he was a Catholic father of 9 and is happy. I am a Catholic mother, reared by the Irish nuns, and mother of 8. And I have, and if Germaine is game enough to be personal in public, and I hope I can be, I have had 8 children in 10 years. 1 hysterectomy, 1 rectocele, 1 cystocele, and 2 varicose vein operations, and I am not happy.
A Saturday morning in Canberra, a dozen women are out collecting signatures to petition the Commonwealth Government for childcare centres with preschool educational facilities. They are members of the Women's Electoral Lobby, an organisation stemming from women's liberation. Only 5 months old, it's already 1,000 strong, with branches in all states.
More Government Day for childcare centres in ACT. Would you care to sign this petition? For which?
Childcare centres?
Yes, for more Government Aid, for more childcare centres.
Unlike women's liberation, Women's Electoral Lobby, usually known as WEL, has definite political ambitions and hopes to galvanise the female electorate into pushing harder on issues that are of special interest to women. Issues like childcare centres, family planning, abortion and education. WEL's convener in Canberra, Gail Walensky.
Interviewers are taking a questionnaire to every candidate in the forthcoming federal elections.
We are interviewing them on areas specifically related to women, that are women's problems. Some of these should be people's problems, childcare, for instance. Now, children are the children of men and women. Why is it a women's problem? That's the way it's become, so it's the women who must now take the initiative. We are interviewing all the candidates. We will be publishing the results of these interviews on a national scale, and in each electorate there will be a much more detailed synopsis of the interview, so that all the women in that electorate will have the information. How does your candidate rate? What are his views on these different issues that concern you?
What do you think the long-term aims will be? Do you envisage, for instance, running a candidate at the next election?
Well, now, that's a very good question, and that will depend on the climate in 3 years' time. We certainly are going to use this information which we're gaining from the questionnaires and from our interviews. We will use this to lobby the members who are in the House after the next elections. We're having a national conference in January to sort of, what do we do next? Where are we going? And we're getting women from all over Australia, and particularly women in the country. Women in the country feel tremendously isolated, and as I've gone around many country towns, and they say to me, we'd like to come to a conference and we want to talk. This is an area which is really being neglected, women in the country. The women's movements have all started in the city. Our questionnaire was compiled by city women, and country women have a tremendously valuable contribution to make. So we will be discussing at the January conference, where do we go next?
Yeah, well, if you hadn't had the photographic stencil, wouldn't have been any problem.
We've got some. I think it,
Oh, I thought you...
it's good.
What's
It's
this?
so simple. That's nice.
Women's electoral lobby differs from Women's Lib in that it wants to reform society, whereas Women's Lib wants to tear down the existing social and political framework and to start afresh. Nonetheless, the membership of the two groups does overlap at times. Many women who won't join a revolutionary group such as Women's Lib because they can't agree with its militancy do support well. Its willingness to work within the conventional political framework attracts many middle-class and professional women who see it as a means of expressing their discontent without associating themselves with the radicalism of women's liberation.
Oh, that's good.
One must realise that women's liberation is a movement, and as such there are different groups all over Australia, all over the world, with slightly different philosophies. Some groups in Australia are staunchly socialist, some are not. There's lesbian groups and so on. It's very difficult to just say exactly what a women's lib is. One of the things which Women's Lib says is look at yourself, look at your relationship with people, look at your relationship with men. Let's examine that very carefully, very closely. Now, this to some women can be threatening because it means they have to look at their home life and they suddenly realise, oh, goodness me, you know, but if I start asking the husband to help me with the children more, you know, he's going to be cross. It's really going to be quite sort of, you know, maybe it's going to be very upsetting, maybe it's going to break up the marriage. Now, WELL is a straight reformist group. We are for obvious reforms, you know, equal pay, you know, and all these sort of things which can be clearly understood and which do not threaten the home. So this obviously attracts a wider base of women. But at the same time, then what I'm finding, certainly in the ACT, is that it then sort of spins back again, because as the women become active in different areas and that they become enthusiastic and they go out and they start doing things, the husband then becomes very interested. A lot of the husbands in the ACT have become tremendously interested in WELL, and the husbands are then keen to, you know, maybe help with the kids. They then become more aware of their wife as a person, as an independent person in her own right, who is capable of doing things. So in some ways, WELL is sort of Women's Lib in reverse.
A great deal of the lobby's energy is currently going into producing a form guide on each candidate standing in the coming federal election. On polling day, WELL hopes to distribute the guide in each electorate, outlining the attitudes of the local candidates to the issues the lobby is concerned with. WELL is backing no particular party, but will urge women to think before they vote.
Doctors, he'd say they don't need childcare centres.
Yeah.
You know, but they
the other one doesn't
employ
actually
people
need
in the
to work.
house, or you know, something else, and he doesn't
Okay.
want one.
To prepare the form guide, the candidates are approached individually by 2 lobby members and presented with a list of 45 questions. Their answers are recorded and collated here in Melbourne before being computerised in readiness for polling day. One of the 3 women who drew up the questionnaire is Carmel Lawrence.
All three of us who did the final working on the questionnaire were psychologists. We've had help, obviously, from a larger group of people, including sociologists, market researchers, people with particular expertise or interest in some areas like social welfare and so on. We drew on a very large population to get the material on which to base the questions.
Are the questions broad or specific?
Well, they vary a lot. We've tried to include very specific questions where an issue is clear-cut, like the question again of the sales tax and the tariff on contraceptives, and they go as broad as trying to get the candidates' opinions of discrimination against women, whether it exists, what areas, and so on. So pretty broad questions as well.
How can you ensure against a candidate's exploiting the female electorate and then ignoring the issues once in power?
Well, the candidate would have to be pretty smart to anticipate all the answers that we think are good answers, and in most cases, even the most apparently sympathetic occasionally put their foot in it, or their feet in it. The question of whether or not they do anything about it is obviously one that we can't really anticipate, but if they've committed themselves firmly to a particular policy, we're going to be on their backs if they get elected. And, you know, whether they think that's a threat, you know, I don't know, but anyway, we'll be following it up fairly closely.
Why has it taken this long to organise women in this sort of political endeavour?
Well, it's the first time it's been tried, that's one reason. That's a facetious one. And why it's so successful at the moment, I think it's very difficult to say. One could point to changes in the child-rearing life of a woman. These days, most women don't have more than 2 children, and so they can't place so much emphasis on being housewife and mum because it's only taking up maybe 6 or 7 years of their lives. That's part of the reason. I think their participation in the workforce has made them more aware of some issues, areas of discrimination. The publicity that women's liberation's been given, I think, is important, and possibly the fact that they've participated in the education system to a much greater extent than they ever had before.
Concern about an issue, it doesn't really hit you, but later on.
Women's electoral lobby has not confined itself to the capital cities alone. In Wagga, it organised a public meeting where local candidates and party representatives were asked their views on everything from abortion to defence. At a smorgasbord beforehand, about 40 local women gathered to discuss their own views on politics. How did it all start in Wagga? Patricia Clark.
I read a magazine article in one of the current popular magazines. It sounded interesting. I called a public meeting, and we've got a group of about 12 women, all of whom were extremely interested, and we went on from there, and that was only in August, so we're quite a new group.
What sort of future do you see for women in politics?
Well, I hope it's a great future, much, much better than now. It's absolutely disgusting that we've had the vote for so many years, and really we're very poorly represented in Parliament. I'm not a militant feminist. I really believe that if you have women working in conjunction with men, you get a better balanced government, city council, or whatsoever. This really is coming right back to the family environment. A family that's run by both mother and father works out better, and this should go right out into our community. It's a pretty conventional viewpoint, I know, but this is my viewpoint and how I feel about it.
What has well meant personally for you?
Well, it's meant a great deal, really. I've started rethinking a lot about politics. I don't know that I was that actively interested before. Mildly interested, but not actively interested, and it certainly changed that. And also little things like I'm being a bit more feminine, a bit more keen on seeing that I'm not discriminated against in clubs and so forth.
Could you give me an example of that sort of thing?
Well, just recently I went into one of our local clubs and I was asked not to walk through a section of the lounge. To get from point A to point B, I had to actually walk down a side corridor. I did this because I was with a group and I didn't want to embarrass them. But on the way out, I got a group of women together and said, "This is ridiculous. Let's walk out the way we want to." So we walked out directly the way we wanted to. Perhaps it was childish, but it was just making our own little protest.
I want to make clear, too, I am not a woman's lib. I believe in the emancipation of women. I'm a true feminist. I believe in the emancipation of my sex, which has been ground down for centuries by men everywhere.
The meeting attracted 300. Locals claimed it was the largest political gathering for nearly 20 years. After the Wagga meeting, the organisers were approached to arrange similar gatherings in 2 other centres.
Which of the gentlemen on the stage would work actively to abolish the luxury tax, which is currently 27.5%, which is imposed on all contraceptives in Australia?
Although over 100 men attended and asked their share of questions, the meeting was arranged primarily to give the local women a chance to confront their candidates.
With regard to the point of a woman not owning a home, the equal right of women to own anything.
There has never been a tradition of female participation in politics in Australia. With a few exceptions, women's role in public life has always been restricted.
I'm certain as that a great majority of Australians do today measure women as their equals. There might be minorities who don't, but the great majority, I think, do. Thank you.
What then are the obstacles women will have to overcome if they wish to forge a new political identity for themselves? Carmel Lawrence.
Well, there's obviously a question of them not knowing very much about what the processes are, what processes are involved. So we've obviously tried to perform some functions of information giving, for example, the question of preferential voting. What does that mean to you in an electorate when you're faced with a choice between candidates? That's one of the problems, that they don't know what the political process is. The other thing is that they're sometimes rather uncertain of their own power. I think they're just beginning to explore it. I think they're the two things, their unwillingness or their unreadiness, I suppose, to push too hard, although that's changing pretty quickly, and a lack of knowledge. But I think that extends pretty widely across men too. I don't think many people know much about politics.
Germaine Greer, who has given notice that Australian women can be a force to be reckoned with.
It's a bit like keeping a canary. You know, people go on about how they don't like to keep birds in cages, so they let canaries out, and the next thing is that canary is destroyed because it can't defend itself, it's got no skills for the outside world, it's conspicuous and so on. So what they then say is, oh well, canaries are bred for captivity. Well, women have been bred for captivity. They're much better off, so they are told and so they think. But my whole argument is that the human spirit is indestructible. And when women have had to do things, like the pioneer women in Australia, for example, they can do them as well as anybody else.
One can only say that one's only partially out to the extent that society continues to exist the way it does. The family's structured as it is, the education system putting the kinds of pressures on males and females to behave in certain ways, then we're all obviously only partially there.
Well, I don't really think we've waited all this time to feel it for the first time. I think women everywhere have been feeling freedom in slow stages. Now it's just the time that's right for us to all get together and do something about it. Germaine Greer was perhaps a catalyst. I firmly believe this. I feel in a lot of ways that in the country she wasn't listened to, wasn't very much liked, but at least she started a lot of people thinking.
In 1920, there were a higher percentage of women in universities than there are now. Surely now, right, okay, we're the canary, we're beginning to fly out. But we did fly out earlier in the century. Why did we go back again? I think that's a very interesting question. And no one really has the answer. Why did we fly back? Why did we get back in that cage and peer out of the bars? Sure, now, that's true. Women are starting to come out.
Terry McMahon reporting on the women's electoral lobby. We all know what's meant by taking a sickie. Last year, absenteeism, both genuine and otherwise, cost Australian industry well over $600 million.